The Westward Eye is a gothic horror audio drama. Mature themes and gore are present. Listener discretion is advised. Episode-specific trigger warnings can be found in the description. Thank you. Somewhere that may have existed long ago, or perhaps is still to come, lies a place isolated from the rest of civilization, known as the West, where lost communities perform ancient traditions, old gods pry themselves from the earth, and monstrous creatures lurk in the darkness.
I hope y'all wore waterproof boots.
Do you really think of us so poorly?
Can one of you please turn on that lamp of yours?
Yes, 1 second.
Working on touch alone, Etta reached back and unhooked the lamp fastened against the side of her rucksack. Dancing light spilled out from the lantern and washed over the sewer tunnel. Murky water sloshed just below their knees and had a strange thickness to it. She tried hard not to think about it as she stifled a gag.
This is disgusting. Oh, the smell.
Tobin was white as a sheet as he clutched his nose tightly, his head hanging low in a nauseous sway. He had always had a weak stomach. Etta expected some snarky remark from Sterling, scolding how they both complained so much, but instead, their guide simply nodded in agreement and bound their neck scarf tight around their face.
You don't happen to have more of those?
Sterling paused for a moment, their eyes difficult to read, and fished out 2 more scarves from their sack.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
They handed a pale, cream-colored scarf to Etta and simply tossed the other in Tobin's direction, who barely caught the unexpected throw.
I don't need one.
Trust me, you will.
Etta eyed Tobin as he reluctantly tied the bandana around his face. While the scarf's scent was far from fresh laundry, it certainly helped mask the nauseating aroma, and Etta was glad for it. She glanced at Tobin, who looked ridiculous with his fine attire and the ratty scarf that now covered his sour expression. Meanwhile, Sterling held their journal at eye level and compared their mother's late drawings to the surroundings in an attempt to position where they were. It didn't take long before they circled a spot with an old pencil and began trudging ahead through the sewage. As Etta and Tobin followed close behind their guide, there was a distinct stagnancy in the atmosphere of the narrow tunnels. Etta thought at first it must be from the lack of nature's touch in this dark and polluted space, but she realized what really bothered her was the silence. It weighed eerily as the faint sounds of crickets and the wind faded away the deeper they ventured into the bowels of the east. With the tunnels being as tight as they were, the trio formulated a single-file line, with Etta sticking close to Sterling and Tobin trailing in the back. She held her lamp as best as she could to illuminate both Sterling's map and the maze of twists and turns before them. Time seemed to drag endlessly as they navigated through the sewer system. The weight of the thick slosh made Etta's legs ache with fatigue. Finally, the tunnels gave way to a moderately sized room, and she watched as Sterling approached a flaking cement wall. As Sterling examined the area, Etta seized the opportunity to rest. lowering herself to the now dry ground and tugging down her scarf to breathe more freely. To her relief, the stench of feces had subsided to a sour tang of dust and metal. Tobin mirrored her action and shifted closer to her. She leaned hard into her companion, finding the steady rise and fall of his shoulders comforting.
Oh, thank you, sweetheart.
We've got to share our strength where we can.
Hey, you two are gonna want to see this.
Sterling gestured to what looked like an opening in the wall before them, a half grin reflecting their find. As they got closer, the pair stared at the hole with more and more disdain. It was barely large enough for a person to squeeze inside, and the shape of it seemed almost that of a mouth, with jagged teeth of rebar and rubble.
This is where the sewer exits into the mines.
We've already been in the sewers for what feels like hours. How long will it take to navigate the mines?
Well, Ma and I were there for days, weeks. But we were lost, and it took time figuring out the proper routes. With this map here, I reckon we could be out by sunset.
Sterling, sunset is 12 hours from now.
Correct.
It's freezing down here. We'll get hypothermia well before noon.
And what about you, Etta? Still up for y'all's little expedition?
You still up for the rest of the cash?
Fair point.
After you.
About that.
Sterling removed their scarf to reveal a sort of winced expression. Instinctively, Etta stepped back, putting as much distance as was acceptable between herself and the expanding darkness beyond the rubble.
I can't hold both the lantern and journal. I can give you directions, but if this diagram is right, it should be a fairly straight shot.
Sterling, I don't know.
No way she's going first.
She's observant and a good leader.
Absolutely not. If you need someone to go first, I can. It's my expedition, after all.
Etta looked towards Tobin, with his citrus-colored jacket, large glasses, and gelled hairstyle. Although they'd been close for well over a decade, she couldn't help but see him as a little kid with messy, long hair, mismatched clothes, and a lopsided smile. They'd both grown a lot over the course of their friendship, but every once in a while, who they used to be peeked through.
It's all right. I'll go.
Sterling stepped aside, allowing Etta to take the lead, and gestured forward with their hand. She hesitated at the looming darkness emanating from the unnatural tunnel, an innate sense of dread racking her body with a quiet tremble. She had never been one for tight spaces, especially dark ones. But as she looked into the eyes of her concerned partners, she felt a surge of courage. Etta shook out her hands before sliding off her rucksack and letting it fall on the ground.
Don't worry about your bag. Tobin can push it through.
Tobin shot Sterling an angry look, but ultimately stayed quiet. With deep breath, Etta filled her lungs with the polluted air of the east for what she feared would be the last time. She exchanged a reassuring look with Tobin, who maintained an expression of concern before pushing her way into the opening, her hand gripping the lantern tight. Dirt and grime caked every inch of the space, and cobwebs dangled from the rocky ceiling, catching in her hair. Minutes dragged on as Sterling struggled to guide her left and right and left again until it all became a blur. It was suffocating. The cramped walls seemed to shrink the more they struggled their way further and further inside. The enclosure pressed into her hips and arms and chest, and she couldn't breathe. How could she breathe with such pressure all around her, with no air? There was no air. The tunnel stretched on, and Etta began to wonder if there was an end after all. Etta's breath caught in her throat as the air around her grew thick with stagnation. Every fiber of her being screamed for her to stop, to turn back. But she couldn't. The rapid pulse of her heart beat like a drum, steadily growing in tempo. Its quickening pace pounded in her skull as her face flushed with a wave of scorching heat. Dirt crushed between Etta's fingers as she grabbed at the earth to ground herself. The sounds of her companions began to fade slowly back amid the ringing in her head. Sterling and Tobin, her friends, were behind waiting for her. She had to keep going.
Etta, it's going to be okay. You're almost there. We're right here with you.
Tobin. She could picture his face, though not as he was now, soaked in sweat and filth, but rather his beaming image in the light of the auditorium only a day prior. It was hard to believe how little time had passed since their graduation, and how drastically their world had turned upside down in that time. Etta held on to the memory of her dear friend, and finally continued her steady crawl forward.
Yes. Yes, okay. Okay. I'm sorry. I'm okay. It's okay.
As if by some miracle, the confines of the tunnel steadily expanded, the end finally in sight.
I see it.
Great job, Etta. That should be our exit.
It was only a minute longer till Etta grasped the exit of the hole and shakily stepped out. The earth graced her feet with an overwhelming sense of comfort as she set the lantern down as carefully as she could, her body still seizing with adrenaline. Etta turned and watched as Tobin and Sterling emerged from the tunnel behind her, covered in a thick layer of brown sludge. The moment Tobin steadied himself, he dropped the weight of their bags to the floor and stumbled over to Etta, clutching the back of her neck and cheek with a firm but gentle touch.
Are you okay?
Yes. I'm okay now. I'm sorry,
Don't. I'm glad you're all right.
Tobin placed a gentle kiss on Etta's forehead and gave her a reassuring squeeze before letting his hand fall. The two took a moment to brush what grime they could off themselves and stretched their sore limbs. Sterling stood off to the side, still remarkably expressionless, their fingers drumming against the side of the journal. Tobin turned to Sterling and spoke up.
Are you good to get going?
Yes, I think that would be best. Even with this map, I don't know how long it'll take to get out of here.
Yes. Okay.
They both gathered their stuff, Tobin taking the lantern from the ground before Etta could, to give her arm a break. Unlike the sewer's confined cement setting, the mines were oddly magnificent. Stalactites reached down from a ceiling so tall it craned their necks to look at, and puddles of loose water reflected beautiful beams of light and shadows upon them. Bits of old decaying wood jutted from rocky walls, framing the various mined pathways they followed. Etta gaped in awe at ancient carvings they passed that scattered the walls with memories of long-forgotten miners, some of whom were more than likely to remain down there, their bodies lost to cave-ins and falling rubble.
Good job managing that. I know it was hard for you.
I appreciate you checking in. Thank you, Tobin.
Of course, darling. We're not crazy for doing this, right?
I never said that we were.
Yes, I know, but it's hard not to start second-guessing. I mean, what if nothing's out there? I don't know what I'd do. Well, we'd have gone all this way, broken at least 10 laws, and then... what? Have it all be for nothing? I'm worried that Sterling knows there isn't anything out there. That they're doing this to make a quick buck off us before leaving us high and dry.
Sterling said it was dangerous out there. They wouldn't be taking us if the West had nothing to offer. They could have just taken the first half and then disappeared. They broke the law too.
I know. It's just been so long. I don't know them anymore, and honestly, Etta, I don't think that I trust them either.
I understand. Sterling is a stranger to us now. But we owe them a chance to earn our trust.
Okay.
Etta shrugged and picked up her pace to catch up with Sterling. Soon after, Tobin followed suit. Deep under the ground, in the heavy darkness, time seemed to lose all meaning. Every twist and turn looked exactly like the last, causing Etta to wonder how Sterling was able to keep track of where they'd been every time they had to double back. Dead ends and cave-ins were common. When they'd inevitably arrive at one, Sterling would simply grumble to themselves, turn, and lead them back the way they came. Etta and Tobin didn't think too much of it, until they found themselves face to face with yet another wall of debris.
Sterling, we have been walking for hours. What's the plan here?
Things have changed since Ma and I were down here. The Earth is taking the tunnels back.
So you're saying we're lost?
No, it's not a problem, just a setback. Here, look.
Leaning closer, Sterling pulled out their mother's journal, its pages now full of new notes and markings.
I'm keeping track of where we've been. These tunnels rarely have only one exit, so logically, we should be able to find ways out if we stick to the map and find a route that hasn't collapsed yet.
And if we don't?
Then we find another way across the wall.
You seem quite confident for someone who keeps leading us to dead ends.
Tobin!
I just want to know what we're dealing with. I don't want to be reassured, lied to. Sterling, I need to know if we are getting out of here or if we should go back and find another guide.
When was the last time someone from the east made it out west? Exactly. Now, if we can just...
A deep rumble reverberated out from somewhere deep in the mines. Its heavy, rhythmic sound washed through the empty channels below them, sending a chilling unease over the party. The sound was unlike anything Tobin had heard before, shaking the very ground beneath him and causing him to stumble.
What was that? Sterling?
It must have been another collapse.
That didn't sound like a collapse.
Well, what else could it have been?
Sterling, you better start talking right now because...
Tobin turned to Sterling, only to find the color had all but drained from his companion's face. They stood, rigid, their hands balled into fists so tight their knuckles were white. Without a word, they began to back away from where the sound resonated, only stopping when the jagged rocks of the mine's walls dug into their backside. Their face, usually so stoic and assured, melted to the fear of a child.
That noise. No, I thought...
Sterling!
It's not real. It's not.
What's happening?
Shh, please, just...
Sterling!
Are we alone down here?
Can you both just be quiet?
The sound came from every direction at once now, echoing loudly in a chorus of pain. Sterling collapsed to the ground, their hands gripping over their ears in a desperate attempt to silence the familiar wails. Their legs kicked at the ground in an attempt to push themselves further back against the cavern wall.
Sterling, what's going on?
Sterling shook their head in an erratic motion, and Tobin helplessly watched in horror as tears slowly began to stream down their face. Etta crouched in front of Sterling, wary to touch them but attempting to snap them out of it.
Sterling, hey, look at me. Sterling, we can't help you if you don't tell us what...
Shh. You need to be quiet. It's going to hear you.
Who's going to hear me?
Sterling, you have to tell us who's out there.
Etta, Tobin, you need to trust me and be quiet. Just...
Sterling's hands grasped tightly around Etta and Tobin's wrists, pulling them down to the ground on either side of them, their expression pleading for the two to follow their command. While there wasn't anything Sterling had done thus far to earn their trust, Tobin accepted that he had no choice but to do as they say, and that terror, that unabashed, horrible gleam in their eyes, was real. Tobin's gaze dared to turn from his panicking guide to the entrance of the room they waited in. The glow of the lantern danced to the vibrations of the cave's rumble, making the space seem almost as if it was breathing in and out and in. The three sat in a moment of breathlessness, every muscle in their bodies tensed with such a fear it ached. Just beyond the reach of light, a disfigured mass darkened the entrance of the nearest mine shaft. The silhouette was unrecognizable to any earthly creature, and its movements were all the more alien. Slowly, it moved closer, twitching and shuddering with every step, almost as if it were a marionette. A scream burned in Sterling's throat to such an intensity they gripped their mouth in a desperate attempt to swallow its sound. As the monstrosity inched its way closer and closer, its sheer size filled the space, effectively blocking any possibility of escape. Pale limbs were the first to touch the lantern's sporadic light. Flesh in the most inhuman sense, in the way it was colored as such, but cracked and pulled tight over jutting bones and muscle. It took a moment to make sense of the mutilated amalgamation, and what they were looking at was its face. Sunken holes bore into its long head where eyes could have once been, now healed over in a thin layer of transparent skin. Below them, its horrible mouth hung open, swaying. Rows upon rows of broken gray teeth sprouted from black gums, thick with a dried substance and drool that spilled out and onto the floor. It was wrong. Wrong in every sense that something so wretched shouldn't exist. It was Tobin who first let out a shuddered breath. The quiet sound rippled throughout the rocky dome. The creature's head instantaneously jerked towards the group, sounding as though something was lodged in its throat, causing it to gasp for air. Sterling watched in horror as the creature crept towards them, muscles shifting under its tissue paper skin. Tobin spared a pleading look at his guide, as if begging Sterling to do something, anything, to protect them. Sterling's eyes kept locked ahead, their body petrified in fear. With what little courage Tobin had left, he reached for where the pistols hung on Sterling's belt. The motion finally snapped Sterling from their frozen trance, Tobin's hand already grasping around their pistol's handle. The panic in Sterling's expression worsened as they tried to silently signal to Tobin, "Won't work, too loud." Sterling mouthed to him, pushing his hand away. Tobin didn't think it possible that something could survive a few gunshots. But then again, he didn't think something like this could even exist to begin with. As the creature moved forward, one of its wiry limbs bumped against the side of the tunnel, causing a long, rotted wood support to crack. Jagged splinters sprayed in every direction. Etta stifled a scream as the creature bolted across the narrow cavern. Its fangs dug into the beam with frightening accuracy, causing it to rip and break within the creature's maw. The cavern's walls shook as it gnawed at the fragile support, but to Etta's relief, the tunnel somehow remained standing. Etta let out a shuddering breath, pulling the creature's attention from the beam and back towards them. Its long, webbed ears stilled, focused on Etta. She could sense this thing was once a part of the world of sun and light, but was now blinded by eons in the dark. This beast was undoubtedly sightless, or they'd be dead already. With only seconds to react, Etta frantically grabbed at the loose stone resting on the cavern floor beside her and aimed it past the advancing beast. Tobin buried his face in Sterling's shoulders, the two bracing for the inevitable. It was mere inches from Etta's face when it finally stopped, the saliva from its gaping mouth dripping on her boots. Etta looked at sunken sockets in the creature's face where two small eyes rested, tiny and useless, covered by a thin layer of skin. The beast crouched low with disturbing poise, its hot breath causing Etta's eyes to water. Averting her gaze, Etta held her breath in an attempt to stifle a cry. Tears trickled down her cheeks as she gripped the heavy stone tighter. In a swift motion, Etta threw the rock, her arm barely missing the creature's rotted form. The stone landed hard at where the creature had once entered and tumbled loudly down the tunnel. The monstrosity that had just been moments away from tearing them apart in an instant, was gone. Its distorted body tore down one of the tunnel's offshoots in pursuit of the stone's echoing sound. Even as it vanished into the darkness, Etta still held her breath. Minutes passed as the uneven thuds and crashes of the creature's chase became more and more distant, till silence welcomed them once more. Etta, Sterling, and Tobin huddled side by side in the quiet for several minutes longer, unable to process what had just happened. The terror that had consumed them only moments ago began to slowly dissipate, leaving a kind of cold emptiness in its place. Tobin was the first to break the stillness, realizing how closely he had latched onto Sterling, and shifted away uncomfortably. With Tobin's sudden movement, Etta snapped out of her frozen state, wiped the now dried tears from her face, and reached inside her rucksack. Her innate terror quickly subsided to intense focus as she fished out her field notebook. She pulled it free from her bag and began scribbling on the first blank page. She wrote,
"How close are we to getting out of here?"
She passed the journal to her companions. Sterling took a moment and wrote a reply.
Close, I think. We have to hurry if we want to get out by sunset.
They passed the notebook to Tobin, who began writing a message of his own.
What was that?
Too much to write. I'll tell you when we get to the west.
Etta snatched her journal out of Sterling's hands and began to write hurriedly. After a moment, she turned the page to face her companions and tapped it gently with the tip of her pencil. The page read in all capitals,
"Let's go. Now."
The thought of pressing on, unbeknown to where that thing lurked in the shadows, made Sterling's stomach sick. But staying here meant certain death. They took a soft breath as Etta stood with a certain confidence Sterling couldn't begin to understand. Perhaps it was sheer adrenaline, or maybe that was just who she was, but it gave the very push they needed to stand up beside her. Tobin sat on the ground a moment longer, staring into the distance with glazed-over eyes. It was the first time Sterling had seen him without some stupid, smug look on his face. Hours before, they would have found this shift in attitude satisfying, but instead they just felt pity.
"Come on, Tobin. We have to move."
Her hand extended down in front of him, his eyes still not meeting her own, but he accepted her hand nonetheless and stood. Etta and Tobin attempted to dust themselves off. The sludge, dirt, and grime from both the sewers and mines seeped ash-colored filth into the very fibers of their clothes. Etta quickly gave up the fruitless pursuit and instead watched as Tobin continued scrubbing his handkerchief hard into his suit with a certain fervor. It was odd for Etta to see his appearance dreary and dull compared to his typical vibrant attire. In a silent fit, Tobin angrily tossed the handkerchief to the ground and ran his hands through his hair. Etta slowly approached him and gently bumped Tobin's shoulder, offering a sympathetic look. While he didn't quite smile, a soft expression spread across his face. He turned to face Sterling, who stood waiting at the tunnel's entrance, holding the journal and lamp out in front of them. As the three traversed the tunnels, the silence between them felt different. It held a sense of anticipation and fear, that the creature might return, and the utter exhaustion they all felt. The hope that they'd be met with fresh air once again was the only thing keeping their worn muscles going. However, as time continued to drag on, the complexity of the tunnels began to offer some comfort. The further they navigated through the mine shaft, the more distance between them and the pale beast. At first, every few feet Sterling signaled to stop as they listened intently for its sounds in the winding void. But as the hours passed, they seemed to grow more confident, leading Etta and Tobin quickly through the caverns until Sterling reached their hand out towards Etta, gesturing for her to hand over her journal. Etta obliged and watched as Sterling scribbled something at the bottom of the page. It read,
I'm going to turn off the lantern.
What? Why?
Sterling faced their companions, stance unwavering. Tobin opened his mouth once more, but was quickly shut down as Sterling raised their right hand. Without breaking their gaze, they began to lower their fingers in a silent countdown, bracing Etta and Tobin for the darkness that was about to consume them. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Tobin felt the breath catch in his throat as he braced for the impending darkness, tensing every muscle just in case the shroud of gloom gave opportunity to something lurking out of sight. It wasn't until he felt a soft tap on his shoulder that Tobin realized he'd been closing his eyes. Slowly, he squinted them open. Rather than more darkness, he saw a glow from a ways down one of the mine tunnels before him. Soft and gentle, it lit the cavern walls in orange and gold. Stifling a gasp, Tobin rushed towards the light, Sterling and Etta following close behind. As he got closer, Tobin could have sworn that he felt the warmth of the sun seeping in. The light cascaded down from a small hole, slightly larger than the tunnel they'd entered from, about 4 feet above his head. Sterling crossed in front of Tobin and knelt down in front of him, locking their fingers to create a foothold. With some amount of effort, Tobin tossed his duffel through the hole, stepped into Sterling's hand, and emerged into the warm glow of dusk. The air was spiced with the smell of sage and flowers. Tobin took a deep breath for what felt like the first time since leaving the East, his lungs filling with the warm desert air. The beauty of the vast valley before them immediately captivated him. Green pillars of spines sprouted up from the red earth. Below them, brush grew thick, providing shelter for the little animals Tobin could hear scurrying beneath. Prickly vegetation spotted the rest of the landscape, seemingly growing in unlimited shapes and forms. Tobin gestured at the pillars of green and turned to Sterling, who, after helping Etta, had managed to crawl their way out of the mines.
What are they?
Saguaros, cactuses, but a lot bigger than the potted ones back east. They fruit in the summer and taste... I think the closest thing to compare them to would be strawberries. If we're here long enough, we can harvest some.
They're so beautiful.
Yes, they are, but don't get too close. Those spines are for a lot more than sun protection.
What are we going to do now?
Now we rest. The sun's going down and we don't want to be caught in the dark without a camp.
Sterling turned and hoisted their duffel over their shoulder, noting Tobin still staring off into the desert. Sterling allowed their features to soften and let out a small chuckle as they watched their home be taken in by new eyes.
Welcome to the West, Tobin.
This was Mar Smith as Tobin, Mikayla Grubbs as Etta, Logyn Clair as Sterling, and Luana McTiernan as our narrator, with Alex Fryer, Jovan Jeffs, and Kyle J. Nelson as the recording techs. This episode was written and directed by Mar Smith and Mikayla Grubbs. Additional voices, contributors, and audio sources can be found in the episode description. This has been The Westward Eye. If you're a fan of what we're making here, please leave a review, share an episode with a loved one, and engage with our social media. You can find us on Instagram and TikTok at The Westward Eye. Thank you for listening.